Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Julie Fleshman, and I'm the President and CEO of the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network, fondly known as PanCAN. And welcome to our webinar today on pancreatic cancer clinical trials. First of all, I want to just say that I hope that everybody is doing well and staying safe during this unprecedented time. And I want to make sure that you know that PanCAN is available to you. Our Patient Central Call Center is open, and I encourage you to call and talk to one of our trained case managers who can answer your questions about pancreatic cancer. Our call center is open Monday through Friday from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. Pacific time. Today's presentation will be recorded, and you'll be able to find that recording on our educational events page on our website. I want to thank our webinar sponsors today, AstraZeneca and Ipsen. And I'd also like to thank all of our current scientific and medical affairs industry members, AbbVie, AngioDynamics, AstraZeneca, Ipsen, Janssen Oncology, Pfizer, Rafael, Tempus, TriSalus, and TYME. Thank you so much to all of you. We couldn't do what we do without you. So today you're going to have the opportunity to listen to our guest speaker and then ask questions. So you can submit questions in the Q&A box at any time. And at the end of our presentation, we will try to get to as many of those questions as possible. And any that we don't have time to get to, someone from our Patient Central team will follow up with you directly. So I know many of you are familiar with PanCAN, but for those of you who may be new to the organization, this is your first time joining us. A little bit about PanCAN. We really fight pancreatic cancer in a comprehensive way. We fund research and clinical initiatives. We do government advocacy work in Washington, D.C. to increase the federal resources that are available for pancreatic cancer researchers. We provide patient services. I've mentioned our call center so that you and your family members have a place to call to get information so that you can make informed decisions about your care. And then finally, we have this amazing volunteer network around the country who are raising funds, raising awareness and visibility about pancreatic cancer. We couldn't do it without our volunteer network and the community engagement, and we encourage you to find out more about what's happening in your community with PanCAN. So today, we're really going to focus on clinical trials. PanCAN is actually funding a clinical trial that you'll learn about today during our webinar. But most importantly, we want you to understand why clinical trials are a very important option for you as patients. You're going to hear from the presenter a little about some of the clinical trials that are taking place today. And then any questions that you have about anything you hear in this webinar, you can follow up and talk to one of our case managers in our Patient Central Call Center. So finally, before we get started, PanCAN believes that clinical trials are extremely important. They're the only way for us to discover new drugs and new treatment options for this disease. So our statement to all patients is that pancreatic cancer patients who participate in clinical research have better outcomes. Every treatment available today was approved through a clinical trial. The Pancreatic Cancer Action Network strongly recommends clinical trials at diagnosis and during every treatment decision. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Lim. He's a medical oncologist and an assistant professor of medicine at the Division of Oncology at Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis, Missouri. He is a physician scientist who treats patients with gastrointestinal cancers with an interest in novel treatment approaches through clinical trials. Through his research, he hopes to improve outcomes in patients with advanced stage disease. He is also a PanCAN Precision Promise Principal Investigator at the Washington University School of Medicine, and I know he'll talk a little bit more about that during his presentation. So Dr. Lim, over to you.
Thank you, Julie. It's with tremendous pleasure and honor that I'm given the opportunity here to talk to you about clinical trials, particularly in the setting of pancreatic cancer. And I just also want to express my sincere gratitude and to all the people, colleagues in PanCAN for the effort that they've done in the past few decades. So today I'm just going to talk to you about, to give you a brief overview about clinical trials, particularly in clinical trials in pancreatic cancer, and why it's so important to continue to push forward in this direction. So we're going to briefly give you a brief overview on the current treatment strategies in pancreatic cancer, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about clinical trials, why we need clinical trials and how they work, and some common myths or misconceptions about clinical trials as well. Importantly, I would like to give you an update on what we are currently doing in the clinical trial ends in trying to defeat this particular disease. And PanCAN has adopted a pretty innovative clinical trial design that I would like to introduce to you as well. And the key goal here is to be able to introduce clinical trials that are available throughout the country to everybody with pancreatic cancer nowadays. So treatment for pancreatic cancer is highly specific depending on the stage of presentation. So most of the patients are presented at the stage when surgery is not an option. And for patients who are diagnosed at earlier stage, that constitutes about 10% of all patients. When the disease is still localized and resectable, they get to see a surgeon, they undergo surgery, and the surgery is commonly called Whipple procedure. And after that, depending on the pathology report, most patients end up getting what we call adjuvant chemotherapy. And that typically lasts for about 6 months, and this is followed by radiation, depending on the recommendation by the treating oncologist. For a substantial portion of patients whose disease are slightly bigger, clinging onto the surrounding blood vessels or structures, when surgery becomes slightly challenging, these patients are typically referred to see a radiation or medical oncologist for consideration of chemotherapy or chemoradiation. After a few months of treatments, there will be a restaging CT scan to determine if the patient is ready for a surgical resection. If surgery becomes an option, patients typically will go ahead and get what we call the Whipple procedure. This is typically followed by further considerations of adjuvant therapy or postoperative chemotherapy or radiation if needed. Unfortunately, for most patients who are diagnosed, the cancer has spread, typically spread into the liver, into the lungs, or into the peritoneal cavity, rendering surgery not a good option. In this case, patients are given the options of chemotherapy, and I'm sure if you have you've personally gone through that, or your loved ones have gone through that, you hear chemotherapy terms such as FOLFIRINOX, gemcitabine Abraxane. These are the two major chemotherapy regimens that we offer in the clinic. Importantly, for all these different settings, clinical trials is always strongly recommended. So the current status, year 2020, chemotherapy remains the main treatment modality that we use in the clinic. Over here on the left side, you can see that for patients who have their disease resected, we typically provide a cocktail of chemotherapy called FOLFIRINOX, which consists of 4 different chemotherapy put together, given over 46 hours or 48 hours every 2 weeks. And as you can see here, compared to gemcitabine, we're able to improve the survival by significantly. So over here, you have the y-axis being the survival, and over time, patients who got FOLFIRINOX regimen have a much better outcome than those who got single-agent gemcitabine. It is also important to note that these results leading to what we're doing in the clinic comes from a clinical trial. So for patients who have metastatic disease, we provide the same cocktail, FOLFIRINOX, and this also was a result from a clinical trials when we compare FOLFIRINOX with gemcitabine, with FOLFIRINOX leading to a better outcome for patients who are otherwise not surgical candidates. So it's also important to point that I want to highlight to you all is that these individual dots, each of them represent a single patient who got onto the clinical trial, who contributed to the outcome and to the current care that we currently have. Each of them represent a patient a story and a family behind it. So it is them that we are currently at where we are giving better care, but we still have a long way to go. So chemotherapy works by disrupting DNA replication. So it's basically, it's been going on for the last 50, 60 years. This is still the major regimen that we use in the clinic. And this is just to give you a brief overview in cartoon form of how it works. So the cells are basically driven by DNAs. Each person has their own DNAs, and DNA has to be replicated when cells divide. And when cells divide, one copy of DNAs gets replicated into two different copies. And cancer cells are particularly good at doing this, and it basically can outpace the normal cells in replicating the DNA, and that basically causes is the reason why they tend to spread, they tend to get bigger, and they overwhelm the body. So chemotherapy works in two different major ways. Gemcitabine and 5-FU are the ones that we use typically. These are basically decoy building blocks. When cells are exposed to chemotherapy, these decoy building blocks get into the way, and as such, cells are not able to elongate their DNAs, and this basically leads to failed replication followed by cell death. Another way of stopping cell growth or proliferation is by breaking the DNA. So irinotecan, Onivite, and these are basically the class of drug that's really good at doing that. But as you can imagine, these are basically a very powerful way of disrupting DNA replications, but normal cells require this process as well. Our intestinal cells, our blood cells basically utilize the same process in replication. So that's pretty much why patients who are on chemotherapy tend to have intestinal side effects and low blood counts. So chemotherapy is heavily used in pancreatic cancer nowadays, but we are slowly moving away from that with more innovative science and clinical trial design. So in the early stage, patients got surgery, followed by chemotherapy. In the advanced stage, chemotherapy is heavily used, and there are two major regimens as we talked about, FOLFIRINOX, gemcitabine plus Abraxane. The limitations of chemotherapies. If you have loved ones going through that, or you have gone through that yourself, you'll know that the side effects are pretty substantial. And this includes nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, neuropathy, low blood counts, hair loss of appetite, taste change, infection, etc. Importantly, chemotherapy doesn't work for a long time and doesn't work in every single patient. So the analogy that I like to use in the clinic is to equate chemotherapy and cancer to weeds and lawns. Cancer grows in a lawn. With surgery, you go in and physically remove the weed. However, they tend to come back, and chemotherapy is basically a cocktail of agents that we use to try to treat the lawn. Unfortunately, this results in some damage as well, collateral damage to the lawn, and patients will need time to recover from it. So that means we need to improve our treatments. And how do we do that? So the two elements that are required to improve patient care and outcome. From a clinical perspective, we need to optimize the care. For pancreatic cancer patients are faced with many challenges. Symptoms related to the cancer include pain, weight loss, poor appetite, jaundice, obstructions, ascites. These are basically symptoms that you're probably familiar with. These are the common symptoms that we see in the clinic on a daily basis. And with these moving forward, patients are given chemotherapy that have their own side effects. So things pile up together, leading to a lot of discomfort and challenges for the caregivers, the patients, and also the physicians. As a result of that, patients and family are faced with a lot of fears, frustrations, helplessness, loneliness, and guilt for burdening others. So these are basically the reality. As a result of that, care for pancreas cancer patients require a team or a village to be able to get through this process without too much of frustrations and discomfort, and be successfully treated. And we need surgeons to be involved. We have medical oncologists giving chemotherapy, radiation oncologists if needed for radiation to palliate pain, to relieve obstructions, interventional radiologists, and in case there's a blockage of the bowel that needs to be stented, interventional radiologists, pain specialists, nutritionists. Poor appetite is the main problem, weight loss is the main problem. You need nurses to help arrange for IV fluid and things like that, psychologists to get patients through all these mental challenges, and also patient support groups as well. So it's highly recommended that anybody with pancreatic cancer or their loved one having pancreatic cancer to be treated by a team of experts. However, the fundamental improvement of the care and outcome for pancreatic cancer has to come from research. We need better and more effective treatments. So scientific research is basically the main process that has to happen in order to deliver new treatments into the clinic. This has to happen in the lab with new regimens or new treatment modalities being brought to the clinic to be delivered to the patients. And clinical research is basically the transition, is basically the bridge to transition scientific research from the lab to the clinic to be given to the patients. And this is a highly regulated process, which we'll spend the next 10 minutes talking about. So clinical trial participation is critical for us to make any progress in fighting any kind of cancer, particularly in pancreatic cancer. This is what we need to do in order to improve our outcome. And patients do better, as Julie alluded, on clinical trials than on standard therapy. Patients are given more attention, or not that they're not given attention if they're not on clinical trials. It's just that there are extra personnel or extra research associates being involved and looking into the data, calling the patients, and recording all the side effects and things like that. So patients get much closer scrutiny and attentions, and while on clinical trials, that will sometimes lead to early detection of problems, and that can be taken care of right away. Patients will have access to cutting-edge therapies, and this is also important, and this is important for pushing the survival better. However, clinical trial participation is generally low, particularly in pancreatic cancer patients. Only 5% of cancer patients have enrolled into clinical trials historically, and we need to improve on that. And there are many reasons that this is happening. First of all, there's a lot of anxiety going on if somebody's diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. There's always a rush to wanting to be treated somehow. And clinical trials, if not available, if patients have to be told to wait for a while for clinical trial enrollment to happen, and that potentially can lead to delay in treatments. And those are all challenges that has to be navigated through before the patient gets treated. So what can we do to try to improve that? So this is just an example that I showed you earlier, that clinical trials are important for fueling progress. And over here, you can see that patients who have been treated with surgery, and when treated with gemcitabine alone after surgery, there is a 30 to 40% chance of cure. But with FOLFIRINOX, which is a stronger regimen, the cure can occur in 50% of patients. So we are making progress. Clinical trials does bring progress to the outcome of pancreatic cancer patients. However, if you look at this particular clinical trial, it was open for 4.5 years. We started for always 550 patients, 550 patients that were enrolled. The study went on for 4.5 years. It was eventually published in 2018. That took another 2 years for the data to be analyzed and to be delivered to the public. This led to this regimen being approved as an option for patients after surgery. It involves 77 hospitals in France and Canada. So it's just simply not good enough, not fast enough. And if a treatment's working, we need to deliver it. We need to prove that it's working and deliver it to the patients as soon as possible. So what can we do to make it better? So in the next 10 minutes, I'd like to just briefly talk about clinical trials, just to give you a concept about how clinical trials come about. Clinical trials are basically broken down into different phases. Phase 1 basically is the very early stage clinical trial where we are testing regimens of therapeutic options that are really new and just coming out from the lab to be delivered in human patients. So the priority of this particular phase 1 trial is to evaluate for safety and tolerability. So this is the first step when we're testing some new regimen. And the trial is typically small scale and with a single institution on just a few patients. Once we have figured out that it's safe and we've figured out a dose for this particular regimen to be given, Then we will start honing into a particular group of patients. What kind of cancer patients do we want to deliver or offer this particular therapy to? And in our case, it's pancreatic cancer patients. Now we are trying to deliver the study regimen using the information that we already know from phase 1 study, the dose and potential side effects that we know how to avoid. And now we're offering it to pancreatic cancer patients in a larger study. Then based on this study, we'll have an idea of whether or not the trial is working. Do we see a signal that potentially could be better than what we have with standard of care chemotherapy or treatments? If we feel that we have a strong feeling that it's working, this would then be open in a phase 3 clinical trials, the largest clinical trials that involve multiple institutions, where we are trying to compare this new regimen versus what we call standard. In the end, if the trial is indeed much better than the standard, it will be FDA approved, leading to this regimen being introduced as a new standard. However, we do have to acknowledge the fact that there is a possibility that the trial is not better, despite being more effective, seemingly in a smaller study, it's just not better than the standard. Or even in the phase 3 studies, where we have to acknowledge the fact that not every patient may respond to it, and we have to figure out why, and how do we make it better? How do we make it better and how more effective for patients who are not responding to these seemingly more promising treatments? This is why we need to perform tumor biopsies in patients who are undergoing study treatment. Pre and post tumor biopsies, despite all this potential risk, but it will be done in highly experienced centers. And these are the information that we need in order to determine why a particular treatment that's effective in some other patients are not effective in this particular group of patients. This is how we improve. We learn from failures. We learn from this information. We learn how to overcome potential obstacles leading to better study outcome. So for any clinical trial to mature from the lab to be delivered to the clinic, it's a very highly regulated process. You're not, as opposed to the misconception that it's basically an experiment coming up from the lab to be given to the patients. It's actually gone through multiple steps. This is just a brief overview of what typically happens behind the scenes. First of all, scientists will have to develop new treatment regimens based on novel findings in the lab, typically in cell lines, guinea pigs, or mice. We do have a very robust pancreas cancer mouse model that we typically use in the lab. And what the regimens that we come up with, we test in these guinea pigs and mice. So this is the stage where guinea pigs and mice happens, not in the clinic. Once the study shows a signal, it will then be, the study will then be written up and will be submitted to journals for peer review by other scientists as well. This is when other scientists in an independent setting would validate if the science is robust and whether this is indeed something that that can be published and should be brought into the clinic. This will lead to publication in good journals. And when that's published, collaborations had to happen with pharmaceutical companies in order to get drugs. And this has then led to the trial being put into the process of being developed as a protocol. And the protocol is usually written by medical experts, including medical oncologists, radiation oncologists, with collaboration with pharmaceutical companies, or with the NCIs most of the time. We'll then need to come up with some kind of a funding mechanism to run the trials so that there's no financial burden to patients. And with the funding agencies, particularly we'll look at whether the trial is impactful, is the design appropriate, and then the protocol will be submitted to each universities or institutions where it will be reviewed by a protocol review monitoring committee. And these are basically independent experts who have expertise in protocol development and clinical trial setting, where they particularly look at different elements in the clinical trials, including whether the protocol adheres to safety guidelines, whether the science is robust. And once we've gone through this process, the trial will be then presented to institutional review board or IRB, where any potential design flaws, problems will be addressed. Once we've gone through this process, the protocol will be submitted to the FDA for approval again. So this is when we decide if the protocol meets national standards, regulations, and whether the science is robust and can be done. Once we have FDA approval, this would then be brought back to each institution, universities, or medical centers for a final check and approval. The trial is then opened and will be offered to patients. Treating MDs and clinical research associates would then follow patients while on protocol and on study regimen. Any potential outcomes or side effects, additional and unexpected side effects and things like that will then be submitted or under close scrutiny by institutional review board. There'll be an independent data setting and monitoring committee to basically look into the data and ensuring that patient safety is a priority, is of priority. This is when we decide if the trial in the end, when concluded, is effective or not before we move on to the next stage. So it's really a highly regulated process and with a lot of parties being involved. So this is just to give you an example of how clinical trial can benefit patients. So over here, you're looking at the survival on the y-axis here, and then this over time. So patients who are treated on clinical trials, shown here in red, has a much better outcome. And the clinical trials are designed in such a way that we detect the genetic defects within a tumor, and we try to match these tumors or these patients to a particular regimen that we have. And for patients who unfortunately do not have mutations that we have a special drug for, the outcome's worse. For patients who are not even enrolled in clinical trials and are treated with just chemotherapy, outcome is also worse. So this is just an example of how important clinical trial is in matching patient's tumor to the genetic, to a particular therapy in order to improve their outcome. As you can see here, even for stage 4 disease, 5 years out, there's still a substantial percent of patients that are still surviving. So some common misconceptions and myths about clinical trials, and these are all questions that I think have crossed your mind sometimes, or when you or your loved ones are going through clinical treatment, that number one, patients are treated as guinea pigs. Like I said, this is not the case. The guinea pig stage happened very long time ago in the lab, and this is all being established as good science and is being delivered to patients in a highly regulated manner. Patient safety is always a top priority, and patients are closely monitored and have rights that protect them. And clinical trials, another myth is that clinical trials are for patients that have run out of options. Actually, no. Clinical trials is always an option, and actually the NCCN guidelines recommend that clinical trial be strongly recommended or considered in any stage of the disease. Patients may receive a placebo and not a treatment. So this is not the case, and we never use placebos in replacement of standard of care, especially in pancreatic cancer. If there is any chance in an unlikely situation where there is a placebo, you will be told that there is a placebo and you have the right to choose not to participate. Clinical trials are more expensive for patients, which is not the case. The federal law requires that most healthcare insurance cover the routine care costs for clinical trial. And if there's any additional drugs or additional visits that's entailed within the clinical trial, these will all be paid for. We try our best to ensure that patients do not have to have any extra financial burden. In most institutions, extra visits are actually covered. The costs for traveling or lodging are sometimes covered as well. Participation in clinical trials is not important, which is also a common myth. It is actually crucial. Patients will, this is how we make progress, and patients in clinical trials do better, and this is how we come up with what we call the new standard. So pancreatic cancer is really difficult to treat, and over the years we have learned a lot more about pancreatic cancer than we did in the past. Now is the time to talk about our enemy here, why it's so difficult to treat. Clinically, pancreatic cancer is really good at hiding. There's no new symptoms at the beginning until it's too late. We don't have as in colon cancer or breast cancer, where we have screening tools like colonoscopy or mammogram. There's simply no good screening tools that we can detect the disease earlier. Anatomically, the pancreas is located in a very delicate area where there's a lot of surrounding blood vessels and organs. So patients when diagnosed, even if the tumor is not big enough, it's already clinging onto these vessels, making it difficult for the surgeons to take it out. And another peculiar part about pancreatic cancer is that it tends to sow seeds from the very beginning. It has a high rate of metastasis. That's why with a tumor that's about 2 to 3 centimeters, we are sometimes seeing a lot of metastatic disease when diagnosed. Biologically, we are quite clear on why pancreatic cancer is so aggressive. It's basically driven by powerful genetic defects within the cells. There's mutations that render them very aggressive, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And our solution is to identify genetic vulnerabilities that we can exploit for therapeutic use. And the structure of the pancreatic cancer is also very unique as well. It's basically treated by very thick fibrotic scar tissues that otherwise are not seen in other cancer types, making it invisible to our body's immune defense mechanism. So having acknowledged that, we do have innovative clinical trials to try to unleash our body's immune system so they can go into the tumor and kill the cancer cells that way. So this is just an example of the pictures of cross sections of over here is colon cancer and pancreatic cancer, just to give you an idea of what I was talking about. This is basically a cross section of a tumor, and actually the actual size is actually the size of a needle. It's just a 100-field magnification just to show you what it looks like under the microscope. Cancer cells are in brown. As you can see here, colon cancer, the whole tumor is packed with tumors. In pancreatic cancer, it's different. Cancer cells in brown are basically hiding within thick scar tissues. This makes it extremely difficult for any drugs to penetrate deep enough through the scar tissue into the tumors. And radiation has a hard time reaching into the cancer cells as well. Here's another picture showing you the immune cells. So this is basically this part of the tumor magnified by another 100-fold, and we are basically staining the cancer cells in green and our immune cells, our good immune cells or killer T cells in red. As you can see here, this is an example from a patient that all the good immune cells are basically outside of the tumor. Yes, we do have some scattered T cells within the tumor, but there's not enough of them, and they're not doing a good job in killing the cancer cells. Most of the good immune cells are shielded or fended off at the periphery or outside of the tumor. So having known that these are the problems, how do we come up with solutions? And this is basically the few major directions under PanCAN and also throughout the countries and different institutions. We have different approaches aimed at overcoming these obstacles. So the three major approaches that we are undertaking now are the targeted therapies, and we'll talk about what it means. Immunotherapy is basically the way to boost the body's immune system to awaken anti-tumor response so that your body can go after the tumor instead of us giving chemotherapy to cure the cancers directly. There are also ways to try to capitalize on the differential metabolism and nutrition processes within cancer cells versus normal cells that we can basically exploit to curb cancer cells growth that way. So these approaches are basically in line with the Recalcitrant Cancer Research Act that was signed into the law in 2012, where the NCI has basically outlined four priorities for pancreatic cancer research. We need to improve on our immunotherapy. We need to have ways to target an oncogene, which we'll talk about in a minute, and the pathways that it's driven by the RAS oncogene, which is so common in pancreatic cancer. So here is just a picture of showing the process from where a normal pancreas duct develop from a precancerous lesions over time into a cancer. So more than 90% of pancreatic cancer harbors a mutation in a gene called KRAS. This is basically an on-off switch in the body. In normal cells, the KRAS genes is turned off most of the time. Only when needed is this protein turned on by a special mechanism or some receptor. It's turned on transiently and then it's turned off. In pancreatic cancer, this gene is mutated. It's mutated to such a way that it's always on. When it's always turned on, it leads to accumulation of more defects and abnormal growth of pancreatic ducts all the way into a cancer. So this process actually takes 8 to 10 years to happen. So, but KRAS is a gene that is mutated in almost all cases. So when turned on, it engages a lot of what we call molecular secretary. These are basically the pathways in the cells that are highly regulated. But when you have a mutation of KRAS, these are all turned on all the time. As a result of that, we get rapid cell cycle progression, improved survival, increased survival of cancer cells, leading to chemoresistance and a dissemination of cancer in the end. Another obstacle that we face with pancreatic cancer is the failure of the body's immune system to overcome it. So this is basically a cartoon showing you what we know about pancreatic cancer nowadays. So when a cancer has grown in the body, that means that our body's immune system has been defeated in some way, or the cancer cell is hiding from our body's immune system. So pancreatic cancer is known to be a cold tumor. It is not, it's really good at sneaking around and not be seen by the body's immune system. So our body's immune system works by recognizing things that are abnormal, such as bacteria or abnormal cancer cells that would secrete antigens that otherwise would be picked up by our immune system. And neutrophil macrophages are basically the cells that are involved in this process. And pancreatic cancer is really good at not having these antigens. And the pancreatic cancer is also devoid or short of a lot of the what we call antigen presenting cells, meaning our body's immune system is just not seeing them. And if you're not seeing these cancer cells, there's no way that we can alert or mobilize the T cells. T cells are basically our defender cells, that's the way I put it. And these are the cells that will go in and to detect any abnormal cells and eliminate them. So if we are not able to mobilize these cells, we're not able to overcome the cancer. In some settings, even if you're able to mobilize a subset of T cells, they're having a trouble getting into the tumor. So this is known, as I alluded earlier, that pancreatic cancer is basically shielded by very thick scar tissues, and T cells have a hard time getting in and getting into the tumors and killing them. So this is pretty much what we know so far, and with a lot of research in the past 10 to 15 years, we know these are the problems, and we now have solutions to overcome them. So these are, in the next few slides, I'm just going to give you some introduction of clinical trials that we have come up with to try to overcome the obstacles we just mentioned. So over here on the left side, it's a cartoon on how we visualize pancreatic cancer. We have pancreatic cancer hiding and being shielded by what we call fibroblasts. Fibroblasts are basically cells that secrete a lot of scar tissues around them, and leading to impairment of drug delivery and also the shielding of these cancer cells from our immune cells, T cells in this case. Pancreatic cancer cells, those are really good at secreting chemicals or cytokines to basically subvert a subset of our own immune cells into suppressive immune cells. And in this case, we are basically, they are using our own immune system against our own immune system. So a subset of immune cells are basically converted to suppress the good T cells. And this is already known, and how do we overcome it? So in this particular clinical trial, we use a combination of chemotherapy to try to kill as much cancer cells as possible. And we introduced a CCR2 inhibitor to try to suppress the bad immune cells. Lastly, we add on a nivolumab, which is an anti-PD-1. It's basically an antibody that unleashes T cells. Using this three-way approach, we are now able to unleash the body's immune system and weaken the cancer cells so that our body's T cells can do a better job in eliminating the cancer cells. So the trial is currently open at Washington University. And another way to overcome this immune suppression is by targeting the fibroblasts. So a drug that we use here in this setting is defactinib. It's basically, we'll talk about an example of how this has been successfully used in patients. And defactinib is basically a drug that will suppress fibroblasts and macrophage, leading to the activation of T cells, which can then be further revitalized with anti-PD-1, leading to cancer elimination. The next way that we can try to unleash the body's immune system is by introducing vaccine. In this particular setting, patients will undergo surgery, and the cancer cells will be used to generate a vaccine. And this will take 3 to 6 months. When the vaccine is being made, the patient will undergo chemotherapy. And when chemotherapy is completed, we have a customized vaccine pertaining to that particular cancer to be given back to the patients, with the idea that if we can mount the immune response, any residual cancer cells that are hiding in the body can be eliminated by our T cells. So last but not least, we are talking, this is another approach that's really highly innovative, where we use SM88, and this is a trial this is a study that's available by PanCAN, where we try to starve the cancer cells using a dysfunctional amino acids. The trial is currently open in 15 sites throughout the country under PanCAN. So what we know so far is pancreatic cancer cells is really good at scavenging amino acids from the surrounding cells. That's why patients lose weight. You lose muscle weight, you lose protein. You're constantly catching up and trying to deplete your protein. So cancer cells are really good at doing that. Why don't we give them some bad amino acids, some dysfunctional amino acids, so we can intoxicate them? If they're really good at uptaking amino acids, SM88 is basically a drug that will be selectively uptaken into cancer cells, and they stay in there and causing intoxication, and the rest of the good amino acids can be reserved for the body cells. This will lead to starvation of cancer cells and death. So these are all the clinical trials that are being available in different cancer centers and by different investigators. The problem is, how do we bring them together so that the patient located in some way in the country can have access to a clinical trial halfway across the country? So in order to do that, PanCAN has adopted a very innovative clinical trial design. So it's called PanCAN Precision Promise. This is a very innovative, adaptive clinical trial design with the following advantages. First of all, it has a unique statistical approach. I'm not going to go into the details that allows us to adapt. So instead of testing one regimen at a time, why don't we have multiple regimens being available in this particular trial platform that patients can have access to? And we are testing multiple regimens simultaneously, and the experimental arms are basically given to patients all at once. And if we find that one of the regimens is not working, it will be stopped very early. And if there's one that seems to be working, it will be expanded. So that's how we can basically tailor our clinical trial according to the signal in real time. So it only requires 175 patients for experimental arms for us to determine if it's working or not, as opposed to 300 to 400 patients. And it takes at least as little as 3.5 years to complete. And patients can receive up to 2 treatments when enrolling to the clinical trial under PanCAN. So we learn every step of the way. Patient samples, the samples and blood samples, tumor samples will be analyzed so that we can better match the patients to the next round of treatments if needed. So this is how it works. So the trial will enroll patients who are newly diagnosed or who have progressed through a standard of care therapy, where patients will be randomized by the computer to receive one of the study treatments, and there will be no placebo here. And all these investigation arms will consist of clinical trials brought forth by one of the major medical centers, so that patients, once you get into the system, you have access to trials that are otherwise available elsewhere. So instead of having to travel halfway across the country, you can be treated locally and by the physicians that you already know, and the physicians who know you personally, and that would lead to improvement of care as well. So patients will go through clinical trials and either control arms or one of the investigational arms, and if it doesn't work out, we'll go through randomization again for patients to be enrolled into another study arm or control arm if applicable. So this will ensure that patients do not have to wait. I'm not sure how many of you or your loved ones were told to wait. We don't have a slot. You have to wait, and then everybody's anxious. So in this particular clinical trial platform, there's always something available. And that's the hope when every investigation arms is filled up with a study regimen. So now I'm going to tell you an example of a patients that are treated at Washington University. This is a 60-year-old mother, a retired teacher who unfortunately shortly after retirement was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Stage 4 to begin with. She was told to have a year to a year and 1.5 years to live. She received a chemotherapy locally, and she went through FOLFIRINOX, Gemabraxane, and unfortunately those didn't work for too long. And about close to 2 years later, her disease had progressed. She presented with enlarging liver lesions and was told by her oncologist to have that there was not much she could do, and hospice was recommended, or she could come to Siteman Cancer Center for a clinical trial. So this was a trial that she got enrolled into, and we talked about this, defactinib, gemcitabine, and pembrolizumab. So after 9 weeks of treatments, her primary tumor got smaller. This is basically a CAT scan of, with her permission, we are able to present this to you, that the primary tumor got smaller, significantly smaller, and her liver lesions, several of them have disappeared, and after 3 cycles of treatment. She stayed on treatments for close to a year, and with not much of side effects. And during this period of time, she was able to travel and do things that she otherwise couldn't do anyway. Unfortunately, she had a progression later on and was enrolled into the trial that currently is available at PanCAN, the SM88 or TIME study. And within just 1 month of treatments, many of her liver lesions have disappeared or even gotten smaller. She stayed on treatment for another close to a year, close to another year. So overall, she had 2.5 years out from being enrolled in clinical study as opposed to being told hospice was the only option. So in conclusion, it's really important for us to consider clinical trials as an option while we're battling this terrible disease. And I just want to highlight the importance of research and the effort of by PanCAN in pushing our clinical trial, our research, and our outcome towards the right direction. So PanCAN was founded in 1999. At that time, the NCI had allocated $17.3 million in pancreatic cancer research, and our survival was 4% at the time. After several years of effort, with PanCAN's help, the research resource has bloomed by tenfold, and this is correlated with improvement in survival to currently 10%. But 10% is never enough. We have a long way to go, and continuing to perform research and the continuation of clinical trials are important elements in improving our survival. So this is the last slide. Basically, pancreatic cancer is still very challenging, but with more research, clinical trial enrollment, we are seeing improvement. Your support and your loved one's support and participation in clinical trials is key to success. It may not always work. We know that, we acknowledge that, but we still learn from every lesson, whether it's a successful lesson or not so successful stories. We still learn from every single patient that participates in the clinical study. You're not a number, you mean a lot to us, and this is how we improve. And researchers, clinicians, patients, families, advocates, all over the country, we need to team up together, and PanCAN is the perfect platform to bring everybody together, to get our heads together, to improve our research, to introduce clinical trials to patients in a timely manner, in an innovative trial design, so we can have a better outcome. So we truly appreciate your participation, and with that, I'll stop, and thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Dr. Lim. That was really an amazing overview, and I think gave people so much information. So we want to turn it now over to, there's been lots of questions that have come in. I'm not sure we're going to have time to get to all of them, but for anyone who's submitted a question, we will absolutely follow up with you after this webinar if we don't get to your question right now. And just as a reminder to everyone, you can enter your questions in the Q&A box. Okay, Dr. Lim. So just if there was some questions about, let's just clarify some facts sort of about clinical trials. In order to participate in a clinical trial, does a patient have to complete their current treatment?
Not necessarily. I mean, clinical trials are always an option. There are many different clinical trials, and if you are already on the current treatments, you're thinking about enrolling into a clinical trial, it's always a good idea to just reach out and talk to the physicians or the physicians at the institutions that have the clinical trials and see where you can plug into the system. And so the short answer is you do not have to wait until you have finished your current treatments. Yes, there's a possibility that you'll be told that you're already on a treatment, let's just see how it goes. But by being proactive, you already be in the system. And once if the treatment fails, if there's any untoward side effects to the treatments you're getting, you already be known by the physicians or by us, and that you're on our list and you get into the system as quickly as possible.
Great. Can someone go on a clinical trial as their first treatment option, or do they need to do standard care first?
Well, absolutely. I think clinical trial options is strongly recommended even at the very beginning when patients are diagnosed. All the clinical trials that we have include the standard treatments. So we are not getting a lesser treatment. And yet there are some, the trials that we have at PanCAN, at a minimum, you're getting a standard, but you also have the opportunity of getting standard plus something else that potentially could be better. And so you're not losing out on anything. And if clinical trial doesn't work out, yes, you have the standard of care treatments to fall back on.
Great. So we hear this from a lot of patients. Why do some doctors recommend clinical trials as a final stage and they have their patients do standard chemo first?
So that's also a challenge that I think we need to do a better job in communicating with all the physicians, our colleagues out there. It is actually strongly recommended by the NCCN guidelines that even at initial diagnosis, before any standard of care, patients be given the options of clinical trials. The major reasons why patients offer standard of care is because it's due to the accessibility to clinical trials. It could be that the clinical trial is not available locally, or patients cannot get onto a clinical trial timely enough and having to wait while the cancer is growing. So these are the things that we are trying to overcome. And PanCAN does a really good job of opening all the studies throughout the country so that patients can go to the even the nearest city or near institutions to have access to all these clinical trials that otherwise cannot is available elsewhere.
Great. So this is another question we hear a lot from patients. Why are the eligibility criteria for many clinical trials narrow so that it eliminates sometimes the option for a patient being able to participate?
Yeah, so a lot of clinical trials, depending on what phase they are in, will target different kind of cancers. Some clinical trials will target patients with ovarian cancer, some with breast cancer and things like that. So in pancreatic cancer patients, typically because of the disease and rapid progression, they're sometimes not doing as well when they show up in the clinic. Their numbers are off. And these are the challenges that will a lot of times exclude them from being enrolled. And a lot of trials do have strict criteria that your numbers have to be a certain way and things like that. So here's another obstacle that we acknowledge as a pancreatic cancer doctor, that this is just something we have to overcome. So with PanCAN, of course, we have trials that are dedicated specifically to pancreatic cancer patients. And we acknowledge that patients are sometimes sicker, so our criteria are basically more flexible. And the key factor here is to get patients onto study as soon as possible.
Great. There were some questions from different people about specific mutations that their tumor has. Someone asked about an ATM mutation, someone else asked about a BRCA mutation. So maybe rather than talking about the specific mutations, just how does someone go about finding out if their tumor has any of these special mutations that might direct their treatment?
Right. So the key thing is know your tumor. And PanCAN is doing a great job in advocating that we do a genetic testing on the tumor samples that we have from patients. If you have a tumor that's biopsy, and we typically will send the tumor samples off to Tempus If you're in a PanCAN setting, it's automatic to be tested and to look for mutations that potentially could have a special drug for. So this is really important as opposed to giving the same chemo to everybody. We are now in the stage of personalized medicines where we have to tailor our treatments according to the patient's tumor. This is something that we have to do, and we are doing a good job doing that direction.
Great. And we've been using the terminology first line and second line, and someone is asking if we can define that.
First line is basically a treatment that is given the first time for somebody who's diagnosed. It's a new treatment, first line setting, meaning that patients have not been treated with chemotherapy beforehand. And unfortunately, sometimes chemotherapy doesn't work. And if it works for a while and then stops working. That's when patients have to be given or considered for a second line of chemotherapy. So it's basically just different chemotherapy given to patients in order to control the disease.
Great. And this is just sort of a general question. If the current chemotherapy that a patient is on is working, they're asking, is it a good idea or not a good idea then to go on a clinical trial?
Yeah, so this is also something that's considered, and we do have clinical trials where we take patients who have stable disease on even on the current treatments. There are clinical trials like that. So this is based on the understanding that if the chemotherapy or treatments that the patient's getting as standard of care, it may work for a while, but it may not work for a long time. There are clinical trials, for example, the Siteman trial that I just mentioned, where we will take patients who have been treated elsewhere with stable disease, and we continue on with gemcitabine, for example, and we added additional regimen to make it last longer. One of the patients that we put onto the trial was on gemcitabine for 4 months, and then she ended up being on the study and had another year out of it. So yes, there are trials that will consider taking patients who are already on a standard of care.
Great. So I know we're getting close to time here. There's a bunch of questions actually from people asking about how do I find out if I'm eligible for a clinical trial? Where do I find out about clinical trials? What clinical trials are right for me? So, I would definitely say they should call our call center and talk to one of our trained case managers who can do a clinical trial search for anyone who calls us and find trials that might be eligible for you for that particular patient. Dr. Lim, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think your first resource could be, it's definitely PanCAN, your oncologist, your primary care physicians. These are the good resources that you can go to, and referral to a nearby major medical centers. And PanCAN is basically present in all these medical centers nearby your home, where we have a dedicated researchers or clinicians there who can guide you better. So the key thing is reach out, call, and if you don't know who to call PanCAN.
Great. Well, we definitely didn't get to all of the questions. There were so many great questions from all of you who participated. So thank you for your questions. Again, someone from PanCAN will follow up with all of you to answer your questions. And I really encourage you to use our call center, get connected with one of our case managers who can also help to answer your questions and find clinical trials that may be right for you. So Dr. Lim, thank you so much. Again, this was just a terrific overview. You did a fantastic job. And I just wanted to let everybody know November is Pancreatic Cancer Awareness Month. And so we would love for you to engage with us and join with us during the month of November to raise awareness and visibility and funds for this disease. You can go to our website to learn more about some of the things that are happening during the month of November, and also want to let you know about a webinar that we will be hosting in November about some of the research that PanCAN is funding and some of the clinical research, more about some of the clinical research that's happening in this field. So please, you'll get an email from us as a follow-up to this, and you can register for that webinar in November. And then just again, a reminder, here's the phone number and the email address for our patient services program. Please reach out and we are happy to help you And just want to say thank you. Thank you for your participation. For those of you that are donors, thank you for your support. It helps us to provide these amazing services for patients and families. We are here and we want to help you. Dr. Lim, you are amazing. Thanks so much for a fantastic webinar. And everybody, thank you. Dr. Lim, did you want to say final words?
Thank you, everyone, for your patience and for your participation in clinical trials. If you have any questions, I think PanCAN will be an excellent resource to reach out to. And just remember, your participation contributes to the improvement of care for everybody else. And we truly appreciate that.
Great, thank you, Dr. Lemon. This webinar it was recorded. It will be available again on our website next week so that you can watch it again, listen to it again. And then also you're gonna get a survey following this webinar, and we would really appreciate you filling that survey out and giving us feedback. It's how we continue to improve all of our services and our programs. So again, thank you, everybody. Please stay safe and be well. Bye-bye.